In a previous Axe from the Grave episode, I attempted to revive this ruined 1970s bass guitar, but despite my best efforts, the neck was so warped that even after corrective adjustments, it still wouldn't play above the 9th fret. While removing the fretboard and installing lengths of carbon fibre reinforcement is one potential solution, this bass neck simply isn't worth that kind of time or expense to repair. A financially justifiable solution, however, is to spend 60 quid on a cheap, unfinished bass neck, convince Guyker to send me a bunch of replacement parts, and spend way too much time restoring the bass into this beautiful specimen you see before you. When I say this neck is unfinished, I really do mean unfinished. Not only do we have to cut this paddle headstock into a more appealing shape, but the whole thing needs sanded, the fret ends need smoothed and polished, and we need to apply some stain and protective coat to act as a barrier between the raw maple and changes in humidity and temperature in the environment. So let's crack out the tools and get started. Our first course of action is to remove the old neck from the instrument and strip it of all of its hardware. While I have no intention of reusing these parts, I do want to use the old neck as a template for our new one. Now, it's never going to be a one-to-one replica for reasons we'll soon get into, but I do want to keep the original headstock shape as a nod to the origins of this bass. Once I've traced the outline of the old headstock onto a sheet of paper, I can transfer that shape to the uncut paddle on the new neck. In order to shape this new neck, I'll be using a few simple hand tools. The first is a cheap variant on a Japanese pull saw. This thin, flexible saw absolutely rips through maple with very little effort. I'll be taking a sequence of straight cuts to remove the bulk of the unwanted material. The shape is then refined by a Shinto saw rasp. This is a wicked tool that's made from a lattice of saw blades, but is wielded like a rasp. There is simply no faster way to refine the contours of woodwork without motorised assistance. And for any tight inside curves, I'll switch to an aggressive half-round rasp. Once the main shape has been achieved, I switch over to 80 grit sandpaper to refine the shape further and take out most of the tool marks. I'll step through 120 and 220 grits to get a workable smoothness for the rest of the process. As you can probably tell, the raw maple of the new neck is much paler than the old neck, which has an amber tinted lacquer sprayed onto it. I don't have the space or equipment to set up a spray booth, so I'll be going with a stain and oil finish instead that can be easily applied by hand. I'm using the amber colour from Crimson Guitar's Stunning Stains lineup. These are water-based stains that can be easily diluted if required. I think you'll agree that this is a pretty good match for the original colour, despite the different technique. Once I've got good coverage with the stain, I'll go over any areas where the water raised the grain and take it back to smooth with some 600 grit sandpaper. This was particularly important for the fretboard on this cheap neck, taking off all of the high spots and leaving a playing surface that wasn't rougher than a cat's tongue. Once I'd achieved the desired colour, I sealed it all with Crimson's Melamine Quick Drying Finish. A coat of this will cure in approximately 5 minutes, meaning I can get a few layers of melamine onto this neck inside half an hour, fine sanding to smooth it out between applications. This forms a thin but hard-wearing water-resistant barrier. This eventually gets followed by a couple of coats of high-build finishing oil. I have no idea if Crimson intend these products to synergize like this, but I've done a couple of necks with this method and they turn out better than using either of these finishes on their own. The high build takes a couple of hours to cure between coats and benefits from a good buffing with a cloth to get a pleasant satin finish. The nut included with this cheap replacement neck is plastic and has been aggressively glued in place. which requires a liberal application of hot air from the heat gun to undo, but not without breaking the nut during removal. But I'm not worried about that because I've got this replacement bone nut from Guyker, which I'll be installing instead. The deep red colour of this nut is a visual reference to the red nail polish that decorated the inlays on the original neck. With a little needle filing to square up the slot, the nut was eventually fitted into place with a tight friction fit that can be easily undone without heat in the future if this nut ever needs replaced. Finally, a quick polishing of the frets and nut brought everything to a shine. I wasn't spending a lot of time here to get this perfect. As long as the neck is functional, that's good enough. A buffing of the fretboard and neck with wax conditioner is the final step in birthing this new neck. However, copying the headstock shape and the colour doesn't get us a functional instrument. There are other, far more important variables we need to consider. As this comes from a German-made bass guitar dating back to the 1970s, we can't simply expect any modern replacement neck to be a direct match for this neck's dimensions. This leads us to two major difficulties with swapping necks on non-standard instruments. Firstly, let's talk scale length. Scale length is the distance between the nut and the bridge on a stringed instrument, and that distance is dictated by the spacing of the frets. The purpose of frets is to divide the string into smaller lengths that usually relate to the notes of a chromatic scale, 12 tones of equal temperament. But different necks can have different scale lengths, so if we replace this neck with one of a different scale length, that will result in the strings being divided up incorrectly for their overall length, and none of the notes will be where we expect them to be. To learn the scale length of any neck, you measure from the nut to the 12th fret, and then double that measurement. This old neck measures 421mm to the 12th fret. Doubled, that gives us 842mm, or approximately 33 inches, which is not the most common scale for a bass guitar. Most replacement bass necks, including this one, are 34-inch scale, because that's the scale used on Fender Precision and Jazz basses. The overall length of the necks might be the same, but the 70s neck has 22 frets spaced more closely together than the 21 frets of the replacement. Now, I'm sure some absolute bastion of humanity will wade into the comments to let me know of some source of 33-inch necks that I should have used instead, but to be clear, this bass guitar was not worth spending time or money to save. The quickest and cheapest option was to get a standard 34-inch neck and simply reposition the bridge approximately 1 inch further back. As long as I measure correctly, based on where the new neck sits within the pocket, this puts the bridge in the proper position for the new neck and scale length. But before we can even get to that point, there is another problem I need to solve: the dimensions of the neck pocket. Just like the scale length, the size of the heel on the new neck does not match that of the original. We're a good 1mm wider on the replacement, which doesn't sound like much, but it's plenty to prevent the neck even fitting in the pocket. Rather than resizing the neck, it makes much more sense to resize the pocket on the body. And since it's only a small amount of material being removed, I'm using a sharp chisel to get the job done, allowing me to remove the material needed for a precise fit without having to create templates for a router to follow. This also allows me the opportunity to clean up the bottom contact plane, as this was pretty rough hewn and paint lumpy from factory. This cleanly chiselled surface will give us a better contact with our new neck, and a tightly fitting contact is the most important factor to achieving good vibrational transfer throughout the instrument. Having all of the string energy die in a loose neck pocket doesn't exactly make for a powerful, sustaining bass guitar. A third issue I failed to consider until I'd stained and finished the neck was the depth of the neck heel. The replacement neck has a thicker heel than the original, which makes it sit far too tall when screwed onto the body, which didn't leave enough clearance for the strings to freely vibrate. So we have a few millimeters of material to remove from the bottom of the neck heel, which was achieved by some aggressive 80 grit sanding, and when that was taking too long, attacking it with a hand plane before resuming sanding. This was sufficient to reduce the height of the neck to an operational level, with the modified area restained and refinished to complete the look. These are the new pickups that will be installed in the bass. They are a set of Guyker jazz pickups with the twist that they are humbucking. Similar to P-bass pickups, these use two coils side by side to provide hum-cancelling operation, with blade poles that will keep the output of the strings consistent with less transient spikes than rod magnet equivalents. Of course, while the covers for these are standard size for Fender jazz basses, the routs on the Honor bass are not standard. They are too rounded in the corners to allow the Guyker pickups to fit, so I'll return to the chisel to square up the routs a little and give enough clearance for the pickups to be fitted. And of course, we'll need to do the same on the pick guard for the neck pickup and along the edges of the neck pocket. Careful use of the chisel and needle files made swift work of this. While retooling the pick guard, I decided to take into consideration all of the moaning comments from people who hate stickers and can't let other people enjoy things, and decided to remove the stubborn old Vans sticker on the pick guard. This sticker has been on here for at least 30 years and has adhered not to the plastic of the pick guard, but to the gloss black spray paint which is covering the original red Tort guard. I'm using WD-40 to soak the sticker. This will penetrate the paper and break down the adhesive, making it easier for this fresh Stanley blade to do the work of removing the paper, scrape up all the goop, and do so without damaging the paint below. Once fully removed, a light buff with polishing compound brought the pick guard back to a uniform, reflective surface. I also removed the Slipknot sticker from the body in the same manner, although it proved a little more challenging in its removal. After some time scraping, all of the residue was removed and the finish left unblemished. There's now nothing left to do but assemble this bass guitar, starting with soldering in these humbucking pickups. I'll be reusing the control plate and electronics as they were one of the few parts of this instrument that were still working as intended. But I will replace these basic plastic knobs for something with a little more flair. See that crisscross affair? Lattice they call that. I've opted for these black dome knobs with the golden lattice from Guyker. The extra texture provided by the lattice will make sure these never slip from under the player's grasp. To keep that colour scheme going, I've opted for this black bridge with the brass saddles. Part of the reason for choosing this one was that it looked like these saddles had a lot of travel, which was important considering I knew I'd be repositioning the bridge for the longer scale neck. However, Guyker catfished me as these intonation screws are only threaded halfway along the screw. That lowest saddle is as far back as it can possibly go, even though it looks like it's only halfway through its potential travel. Guyker, if you want to improve this bridge saddle, then update the long bolts so that the thread goes along their entire length. Moving up to the headstock, Guyker provided this string retaining bar, which is a significant improvement over the small button on the original neck, which wasn't wide enough to properly retain its two strings. This bar will let me retain up to 4 strings without issue, although 3 strings will be sufficient for this headstock design. These black open gear tuners are interesting. Not only does their design make them lightweight, but they also feature this tiny grub screw in the shaft, which makes them locking tuners, which is something you don't often see on bass tuning machines. Although, I'm not entirely sure what the point of this is. They require a separate tool to set up, and in use are honestly a bit of a faff to deal with, removing the one and only objective advantage of locking tuners: speed. It's quicker simply not to use the locking feature, and as these are split post bass tuners, there was never any possibility of string slippage in the first place. A feature for the sake of there being a feature, I suppose, but fortunately, the build quality and operation feel of these tuners is exceptional, which more than makes up for this superfluous locking inclusion. And because I felt a little bit guilty about removing that Slipknot sticker, I decided to bring back a little satanic imagery to this bass with a ram's head pentagram neck plate. Yes, that is a 3-dimensional emblem that gives a secret, sinister touch to the dark side of this fully operational bass guitar.